perhaps no function of government is more important than public safety. Despite its importance, however, little is known by the public or policymakers about how the state's criminal justice system actually operates. Recently, the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst updated its seminal publication, California's Criminal Justice System, a Primer, to provide the public, the media, and policymakers with some basic information on the state's criminal justice system, caseload, cost, trends, and outcomes. We'll talk with its author, Brian Brown, Managing Principal Analyst on Criminal Justice at the California Legislative Analyst's Office. Crime in California, just the facts.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. The primary goal of the criminal justice system is to deter and prevent crime, punish individuals who commit crime, and hopefully turn ex-criminals into productive members of society. Are those goals being met effectively and efficiently in California? And what can be done to improve California's criminal justice system? Our guest is Brian Brown, Managing Principal Analyst on Criminal Justice for the California Legislative Analyst's Office and author of a recent report entitled California's Criminal Justice System, a Primer. So welcome to the Maddy Report.
Well, thank you for having me.
First, let's briefly explain for folks the criminal justice system, the role of the state and local agencies, the types of crimes, and the stages in the process.
Sure. Well, to start with crimes, perhaps, that's the easiest place to start. We can categorize crimes in different ways. Certainly there are violent crimes, property crimes, drug crimes, and some other types of crimes. And then these crimes are then categorized by their seriousness, their severity. So felonies are the most serious types of crimes. It can be punishable in many cases by state prison. Misdemeanors are less serious crimes and are generally punishable by jail or probation. And then we also have infractions, which are your least serious crimes. That'd be your typical speeding ticket, for example.
Which I've never received.
I'm
sure. Well, so the most prevalent type of crime, I'm assuming then, is the infraction?
Yeah, that'd be right.
Okay, so who's committing crimes generally? If you're taking a look at that.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of research out there about who commits crimes. In general, it tends to be males more than females. It tends to be younger offenders. That's usually is still adults, but of course we have juvenile offenders as well. But
when you say younger, is it like 20 to 29?
Usually under the age of 40, most disproportionately. And then of course also minorities are disproportionately both the offenders of crime as well as victims.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that in terms of the victims. Who are the victims?
Actually, very similar profile, disproportionately male, disproportionately younger, and minority.
Okay. So what is the trend in crimes? Are we seeing a spike in crime? Or is crime going down? What's happening with crime?
Actually, for the last 20 or 30 years, really since 1980, crime rates in California have been declining. So just over the last 20 years, crime rate has gone down by about 50%.
That's quite a big decline. What is the cause of that decline?
Well, no one's really sure. Actually, what's really interesting about that is California is not unique in that regard. So that decrease in crime has really been a national trend. And so a lot of researchers are out there trying to figure out what's driving that. And there's just not a consensus right now.
So some would argue that, California's getting tough on crime, like 3 strikes has driven that crime rate down. You're saying that even in states that don't have 3 strikes, the crime rates are also low?
That's right. That's
okay.
right. And
okay, I'm sorry.
Well, and so the different factors that researchers have looked at, again, there's not a lot of consensus. So it's probably actually a number of factors. It could be product of demographics to some extent, product of policing strategies that have been employed in different areas. It's hard to disentangle, though, when you see that decline in all kinds of different jurisdictions with different policies and practices.
That's interesting because normally you would expect when the economy starts to tank that crime would increase, yet you're still seeing a decrease in crime.
Right, and that's been sort of a classic theory, but actually really very consistently for the last 20 or 30 years, crime has been going down even as the economy has fluctuated.
This is all based on the premise that all crime is being reported. Is all crime being reported?
No, actually only about 50% of all crimes are reported to the police.
I think I read a statistic that said that half of the violent crimes are only being reported, but over 60% of the property crimes are going unreported nationally.
Right.
So people, they're burglarized or something and they don't report it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting trend, but it's consistent over time and across jurisdictions. People are more likely to report crimes when they know who the perpetrator is.
So if it's your family member, you're going to call on them.
Well, maybe it depends on the specific nature of the crime and who the perpetrator is.
It depends on the family member too, maybe.
Absolutely, but of course there's research that shows that in some cases victims don't believe the police will be able to help them and so may not report a crime. In other cases, victims may be fearful of reprisal and so may not report for that reason.
Okay, so how many arrests are made each year?
Well, in California, there are about 1.3 million felony and misdemeanor arrests made in 2011.
Now, is that statistic going up or down or sideways or what?
It actually has been declining the last 6 or 7 years, and so a couple of things have probably contributed to that. So one has been the decline in crime rates. That's probably been one factor that's driven down the number of arrests that have had to have been made. But the other factor probably in more recent years has been the recession. So we know that in many jurisdictions, police and sheriff have been cutting their law enforcement officers and staff. So they probably have just had fewer people available to investigate crimes and make arrests.
Okay, there might be as much crime going on, just not getting as many arrests because there are fewer cops on the beat, basically.
That could be.
So what about staffing levels? How are staffing levels in California compared to other states?
Well, in California, we have about 80,000 sworn law enforcement officers, so police officers and deputy sheriffs primarily. This ranks us on a per capita basis about 10% less than the national average.
And what's the cost of a police officer in California, say, compared to another state?
Well, it varies, of course, from state to state. An individual officer in California, because cost of living is on average higher than most other states, we do spend a bit more. Interestingly, in California, in total, we spend about $14 billion a year on local law enforcement costs, and that actually ranks us second in the nation after New York on a per capita basis.
And even though we have fewer cops per 100,000 population, the cost of police officers means that for the cost for an average Californian is actually fairly high?
Yes.
Okay. Well, when we come back, we'll have a discussion about criminal prosecutions in California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Brian Brown from the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst's Office and author of a report on California's criminal justice system. So what is the state's role and what are the county's role in criminal prosecutions?
Sure. Well, the state funds and operates the court system since 1997. The courts used to be a county responsibility, but now they're state responsibility. That being said, counties still play a very important role in the prosecution of crime. Specifically, district attorneys who are elected officials prosecute the crimes, and the public defenders who are county employees are the ones who represent defendants in criminal cases.
And just a footnote, recently in the governor's budget proposal, there was actually a cut for the state court system, and people are concerned that the state courts are taking a hit in terms of the amount of money they're receiving from the state. Let's talk about another issue in terms of crimes reported and then that actually turn from arrest to prosecution. I mean, how often does that happen?
Well, actually, it's actually more common for a crime not to be taken, that is, a crime that's reported not to be taken to trial. So only about 20% of all reported crimes actually result in an offender being prosecuted.
So someone commits a crime, there's an arrest. First of all, it's underreported. So you may have a crime, you don't even report it. Right. Then those who do get reported, they get an arrest, but even those that are arrested don't necessarily end up in prosecution?
Well, it's the number reported. So about 20% of crimes reported end up in a prosecution. So again, a crime may be reported. Someone may report that their house has been burglarized, but if the law enforcement agencies, if the police can't identify a suspect, then they can't, even if it's been reported, they can't arrest someone and send it to the prosecutor.
What makes it more likely that a crime is going to be prosecuted?
Probably the key factor is whether or not the victim knows the perpetrator, is able to identify a perpetrator, and the offender is able to be arrested and then referred to the prosecution.
So you've got a person arrested, they're prosecuted. How many are likely to end up in a guilty verdict or a plea bargain versus how many are going to end up in acquittal or dismissal?
Well, about 4 out of every 5 cases that are taken to court actually do result in a guilty, either a plea or a jury trial, but in a guilty finding in the end.
80%?
80%.
Wow, that's a pretty high number. A little surprising. So, but 20% don't?
That's right. Okay,
so there usually is probably some good evidence when they bring a case forward, probably going to end up in prosecution and a guilty verdict. So what about plea bargains? You hear a lot about plea bargains. Are they very common in felony cases?
They are. They're very common. In fact, about 95% of all guilty findings are done through a plea bargain rather than a
Did you
jury
say
trial.
90%?
95%.
95%.
Right. And that's actually very important for our criminal justice system, for our court system, because you can imagine if 95% of those cases had to go to a jury trial instead of being resolved through a plea bargain, that would be hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in additional cost for the judges, the juries, the staff time, and the prosecutors.
So what you see on shows like Law and Order about prosecuting all these cases, that really doesn't, the normal course of events is it's a plea bargain.
That's right.
In a felony. Okay. What about the states dealing with juveniles? How many of juveniles are being tried in adult court? Does that happen very often?
It doesn't happen very often. Only about 1% of all juvenile cases are resolved through the adult court system.
1%?
1%.
Why is the number so low?
Well, there are certain limitations, so only certain crimes and juvenile offenders are eligible to be heard in adult court, usually the more severe crimes, serious and violent crimes, and for those juvenile offenders who are tend to be a little bit older. And also the courts tend to have a lot of discretion, and I think tend to push cases towards the juvenile delinquency court, which has more of an emphasis on rehabilitation versus punishment.
You know, you talked about the fact that we spend about $14 billion on police officers in California. How much do we spend on state courts in criminal cases?
Well, the state spends in total about $3 or $4 billion on the judicial branch. Of that, about $1.5 billion is spent on the criminal cases. So that includes felonies, misdemeanors, infractions, and as well as juvenile delinquency. And then in addition to that, counties are spending probably a similar amount, about $1 to $2 billion on prosecutors and defense.
And what's the biggest cost?
Clearly, felonies are disproportionately more expensive than the other types of cases because even though most of them are pled, there's a lot more evidence that has to be gathered, and when they do go to trial, they can be longer cases to resolve.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll talk about corrections in the prison system from state prisons to county jails. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Brian Brown, Managing Principal Analyst on Criminal Justice for the California Legislative Analyst's Office. So who is in our county jails and state prisons by age and race? And by the way, I want to make it clear for our audience, there is a difference between a jail, which is county,
Right.
and a prison, which is state. So anyway, so who's in the prison population?
The profile of offenders.
Right.
Predominantly male, so 80–90% of inmates in jail and prison are male. They're disproportionately younger and minority, so probably 2/3 of inmates are minority, for example.
So county jails, let's focus on them for a second. Who's in county jail? Are they people that have been convicted of crimes, or are they people awaiting trial?
It's a mix, and actually in California, about 70% of all jail inmates are those who are unsentenced, so that means they're awaiting trial, and they either haven't made bail or bail's not available to them.
Okay, so let's talk about realignment. That's changed who's going to state prisons and who's going to county jails, correct?
Right.
How did it change that?
Well, prior to 2011, when the state passed realignment legislation, and by realignment we just typically mean a shift in responsibility between state and local governments. And so what happened in 2011 was that the state said, from now on, in order to be eligible to be sentenced to state prison, an offender has to have either a current or a prior conviction for a serious or violent or sex-related offense. Prior to that, any felony was eligible for a state prison sentence, although, to be clear, even prior to 2011, most felony offenders were not sentenced to prison, but instead got county probation.
Okay, so what impact is realignment going to have on the state prison and parole populations?
Major declines. So there are probably going to be about 30 or 40,000 fewer inmates in state prison over the next year or so. And the parole population, because there will be fewer people coming to state prison, there will be fewer people released to state parole. And so we're actually going to see a larger decline in the parole population. That'll decline by about 70,000 parolees.
And one of the reasons for this shift of moving from state prisons to county jails is also federal or court decisions saying you had to reduce your prison population, correct?
That's right.
So the state is also going to benefit by not paying as much because they're shifting that responsibility to county jails.
That's right.
Okay, so let's talk about life sentences for a second. How many life sentences are out there, and is that increasing or decreasing?
Well, and so life sentences are for those inmates who have gotten a sentence of, for example, 25 to life, and that means they have to serve a minimum of 25 years in prison, but could be a life term depending on whether or not a parole board decides to release them sooner. Right now, about 20 or so % of all state inmates are lifers.
Wow, that's a large, and so they're aging.
Yes.
And so what are the implications of that population aging in the prisons?
Right, so we've seen for example, the average age of the inmate population increase. The percentage that are 50 or older is quadrupled over the last 20 years. And this is really important, particularly for cost. It's much more expensive to house an older inmate, primarily because of their medical needs. They tend to have chronic conditions and have higher medical needs.
So what's the annual cost of housing someone in a state prison, and what's the primary driver of those costs?
Costs over $50,000 a year to house someone in California state prison. Interestingly, this is far more than other states, which spend about $30,000 a year.
So what do you attribute the difference in cost?
Well, probably two primary differences. One, in California, we tend to pay our staff more than most other states, a higher cost of living. The other major factor has been health care costs. So we spend far more on inmate health care than other states.
You know, there's besides the county jails and state prisons, there's also a differentiation between state parolees and county probation folks. So why is the failure rate so much greater with state parolees than people in the county doing probation?
Well, part of it has to do with the difference in who these populations are. So county probation tends to be lower level offenders. State parolees tend to be those offenders who have been sentenced to prison and are more serious or violent offenders. So some of it may be attributable to them being more serious offenders. And then part of it also has to do with the fact that over the years the state prison system has offered relatively little in terms of rehabilitation programs, so education programs and substance abuse treatment and so on. And so it's probably not surprising that some number of inmates are released from prison and are not rehabilitated.
And that's the argument, isn't it, that at the county level they're doing a better job of that?
That's certainly the expectation, and that was an important rationale for realignment, which was that counties are probably better situated to manage lower level offenders. They have the services in their community, they have the connection to families and other education, employment, rehabilitation types of services.
You know, the cost for juvenile offenders is much greater than the cost of state prisoners. Something like $50,000 for a state prisoner, but $200,000 for a state juvenile facility. And even at the county facilities, it's $120,000 for juvenile offenders. Why is the cost difference so great?
Well, again, probably a couple of factors, not the least of which is that in recent years our juvenile justice system, we have the Department of Juvenile Justice that runs these our state facilities, and they've been under court orders to improve services, and that's involved more staff, more access to services. That's become more expensive, and we spend a lot more than, say, our prison system does on rehabilitation and treatment programs.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll talk about the significant policy changes that have occurred and will likely occur in California's criminal justice system. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Brian Brown from the nonpartisan California Legislative Analyst's Office and author of a recent report on California's criminal justice system. So what have been the major changes in criminal law in California over the last 20 years?
Well, they've been numerous. Probably two trends I'd highlight. The first is during the 80s and 90s, we saw both in California and nationwide efforts to increase penalties for criminal offenders, so longer sentences. And probably the best example of that in California was the 3 strikes law that gave, in some cases, life terms to certain repeat offenders.
That was initiated by Mike Reynolds from Fresno.
That's right.
Yeah. So that's been one of the major changes. Any other major changes in state law in criminal justice?
Yeah, I think the other major change has actually been a shift of correctional responsibilities from the state to county. So we talked already about the realignment of adult offenders. There was actually a similar trend that started 10 or 15 years ago on the juvenile justice side as well.
It seems like there was a shift to the state after Prop 13 because he who has the gold makes the rules, and then recently the state said, oh, no, now we're going to shift it back to the local level, not just in criminal justice, but in a lot of things like education, for example.
Right.
Let's talk about some significant criminal justice issues that may be important in the future. I mean, obviously one of the big ones is realignment. Let's focus on counties for a second. What are the challenges that counties are going to face with realignment?
Well, they'll have numerous challenges, if only because this is going to be a large number of offenders, tens of thousands of offenders that they're going to have to manage that they haven't before. This will be particularly challenging, I think, for the jail system. We already have a number of jails that are overcrowded and have population caps. So the idea of that those jails are going to have to take on additional populations is a real concern, and particularly because these offenders in some cases may have longer sentences than they would have otherwise.
Yeah, because county jails, I think, were set up for folks not staying there for a long time, right? And so now they're getting folks that are staying there, and they're not just set up for that.
That's right. And so one of the concerns is if you have offenders that are spending longer periods in jail, do you have to have greater health care facilities to treat more chronic conditions that you might not have otherwise seen, for example?
Well, let's talk about the implications for the state prisons as opposed to the county jails. What are the challenges and opportunities that come along with realignment?
Well, for the state, the biggest opportunity is realignment's really critical for the state to be able to meet the federally imposed population cap on the prisons. Now, it's a little bit unclear right now as to whether or not the population will quite reach that cap or not, but it should get us pretty close. And in conjunction with that, it should also make it easier for the prisons to deliver health care, mental health, and other rehabilitation services.
How are we going to know whether or not realignment worked?
Well, that's probably the $1 million question for the next 5,
or maybe
10,
$1 billion
50,
question.
Yeah, maybe more like $1 billion. That's right. So it's going to be an inherently difficult question to answer. People are going to be inclined to look at crime rates and say, well, what's happening with crime rates, and attribute whatever trends they see over the next few years to realignment. And that's probably not really the right approach. And the concern would be that there's so many factors that contribute to changes in crime rates that distinguishing the specific effect of realignment is going to be difficult. Now, counties may want to look at what's happening in their individual communities, and if they see, for example, an increase in crime or recidivism, they may want to again attribute that to realignment. And even if they are able to do that, identify which offenders will realign and what's happening to them, one of the concerns is how do we distinguish between what's the effect of the realignment policy, and is the realignment policy what's contributed to an increase in crime, or was it how the county implemented the policy? Did they provide the right types of treatment and services and supervision?
What about inmate health care? We talked about that earlier. Federal court has taken oversight of inmate health care. Why did that happen?
Well, the federal courts found both in the area of medical and mental health care for inmates that the state was providing unconstitutional level of care, that it basically constituted cruel and unusual punishment because the access to services was so deficient that inmates were being deprived of basic rights to health care.
So not even minimal rights they were receiving, so the court stepped in. So what's the likelihood of returning the prison health care system to the state, and what's the state going to have to do to maintain a constitutional level of inmate health care?
Well, we don't have a specific timeline from the court for when this is going to happen. There are some positive signs. For example, the Office of the Inspector General does routine audits of the prison medical program, and we've seen consistent improvements there. So that's a good sign.
I want to ask one last question before we leave, and that is, how can we implement policies that are, smart on crime? Are there examples of folks that are doing this well?
There are. So actually in California and other states, Texas, for example, has been one state that implemented a wide array of different intervention strategies that are evidence-based. So they're based on research that says what works at reducing recidivism. And what's really interesting about the Texas example is they not only have implemented these programs, reducing costs to run their prisons, they've actually seen reductions in recidivism and been able to reduce the number of prisons they've had to build over the last couple of years.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to thank Brian Brown, Managing Principal Analyst on Criminal Justice for the California Legislative Analyst, and author of a recent report entitled California's Criminal Justice System, a Primer. Thanks for joining us. If you want to keep up to date with state and local politics, you can sign up for our free and award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging onto our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
A few days back, a prominent Republican consultant cracked a mischievous grin and told me crime is back. Senator Jim Nielsen, a Republican who represents the northern end of the Central Valley, regularly puts out press releases detailing the latest instance in which a criminal released from jail commits a terrible crime. An account in the LA Times the other day detailed the case of a convicted felon who allegedly stabbed a woman to death in Fontana. San Bernardino County officials were quoted as saying the crime exposed flaws in Governor Jerry Brown's plan to give local government more responsibility for nonviolent prisoners. Brown has upset the status quo with this effort. No doubt there will be mistakes, bad people will commit horrible acts, and there will be political animals ready to seize the opportunity. Expect one initiative and maybe more on the 2014 ballot dealing with criminal justice-related issues. Against this backdrop, the Legislative Analyst's Office has done its best Sergeant Friday impersonation. Just the facts. A report issued in January cites several. In 2011, the overall crime rate in California was below the national average. Between 1991 and 2011, the state's overall crime rate declined by 56%. The violent crime rate in California has fallen by 63% since its peak in 1992. Of course, this is an average. Central Valley counties have unacceptably high crime rates. San Joaquin and Fresno counties have the highest, and averages provide no solace to the victims of crime. But before the state reverses itself and starts adding to the prison population, perhaps we should take a few minutes to ponder the facts. This is Dan Moraine of the Sacramento Bee for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.